The Matthew chapter 24 Paradox, Part 3, KJV. Verse 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him, for to show him the buildings of the temple. Verse 2. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down. Verse 3. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? In Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, we read of three questions that Jesus' disciples made to him. In this video, I will begin to reveal what were the answers given by Jesus to them. In reading Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, there is something that maybe most Bible experts have not noticed. And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Notice sign, singular, not signs, plural. We do not read signs, but sign in verse 3. I noticed this apparently insignificant detail because it is taught that Matthew chapter 24 is a generation of signs that will precede the second coming of Jesus Christ. But if one notices the questions of the disciples about the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, they did not ask the signs, but the sign. One sign, and not more than one sign or signs. We read sign and not signs. Jesus, in responding to their question of what this sign is, answers with Matthew chapter 24, verse 4, KJV. Verse 4, And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. A generation where church teaching is attacked by lies and deceivers could be any generation. But notice that Jesus apparently skips the first question on when the temple be destroyed. And from verse 4 begins to preach on something that apparently has little to do with the temple, standing in his time, as we then begin to read from verse 4. I say this because, according to some experts, Jesus skipped the first question to then go answering the second question and third question about what would be the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, without giving any date or measure of time to determine when the temple were to be destroyed. From what I understand in reading these verses in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus began answering all three questions with what we then read beginning in verse 4, with the exception that from verse 4 to verse 31, there are no date setting of the events of this chapter and Bible source of end-time prophecy, of the answers that Jesus gives to his disciples from the three questions that Jesus' disciples made to him in verse 3. In other words, he prophesied the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, standing at the time of his preaching. And we had that destruction in 70 AD, and in Jesus' generation. But from what I understand by studying Bible end-time prophecy, Jesus prophesied future events, but not giving any date of when such events were to come to pass. Now, of course, as we all know, the calendar they used back then was not ours, but at least he could have gave the number of generations that would come to pass before that generation that he speaks about in Matthew chapter 24. For example, in Matthew chapter 24, in verse 36 to 37, verse 36, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Verse 37, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." If Jesus would have given some date of years of the temple destruction, being that destruction of the 70 AD destruction of the temple, then how would he then explain that there would be no second coming and the end of the world in his generation? By not giving any date of the destruction of the temple, though prophesying its destruction, would mean that he knew that his return would not be in his generation, and not at the time of the 70 AD destruction of the temple, and that the destruction of the temple was not the sign of his second coming. I believe that he himself did not know. I believe that he himself did not know when his second coming would come. And this is revealed in verse 36 and 37, though revealing to his disciples under what conditions and circumstances the world and his church would be in at the time of his second coming. This would mean that the temple destruction, or even the presence of any temple, is no major sign, and its destruction not the sign of his second coming. Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple, standing in his time, in verse 2, but without adding in verse 2 that before that the temple were to be destroyed, an abomination of desolation were to be made in that temple. But then in verse 15 speaks of an abomination of desolation in some holy place, but not specifying what this holy place is, or if it being that temple standing in the time of his preachings to his disciples. This could only mean that Jesus prophesied two different events in two different times, by which first in verse 2 prophesies the temple destruction of the 70 AD event, but without giving any date of when it would be destroyed, and then questioned by his disciples in verse 3 of when it would be destroyed and what would be the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, does not give any date of its destruction, and moves on to reveal what that sign is of his coming and the end of the world, beginning from verse 4, as if the temple of Jerusalem, standing at the time of his preachings to his disciples, was no major sign of his coming. But why would Jesus not reveal the time of the temple's destruction, or the 70 AD abomination of desolation with destruction of the temple? I believe so not to cause confusion between what he prophesied in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 2 and what would then be the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, beginning from verse 4 to verse 31. So not to cause confusion between two future events, to show that the presence of a temple of Jerusalem, whether it be that temple or a future third temple, is in itself not the sign of his coming and of the end of the world. A future abomination of desolation, from that future of the 70 AD abomination of desolation, with destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, this time set in some unspecified holy place, as we read in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. Verse 15, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, Whoso readeth, let him understand. In my opinion, the reason why Jesus did not answer to the question of the when the temple was to be destroyed is that, as I already said, so not to cause confusion. And I have picked up at least 4 reasons so not to cause confusion. Reason number 1, that his disciples believed that the temple's destruction would be around the same time that of his coming, and with it the end of the world. That they, by those questions made to Jesus, were seeking some date by which all 3 events, destruction of the temple, sign of his coming, and the end of the world, would be fulfilled in the same generation. Reason number 2, that they would believe that the temple destruction in itself would be the sign of his coming and of the end of the world. In fact, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and an abomination of desolation was even made, but there was no second coming, and neither the end of the world. Reason number 3, that the temple destruction represents no major sign or no major event, a sign of his coming and of the end of the world. Reason number 4, the generation that Jesus speaks about in Matthew chapter 24, that will witness the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, from verse 4 to verse 31, was not that generation of his preachings, but a future generation from that of the 70 AD event. Thank you.